Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture a single moment, just one ordinary moment, that could have changed everything about the world, you know. Not some grand declaration or massive battle, but something as simple as 3 cigars wrapped in paper, lying forgotten in a Maryland field. Because that's exactly what happened on September 13th, 1862, and what I'm about to tell you might just blow your mind. You see, history loves to trick us into thinking that the big events, the wars, the revolutions, the rise and fall of empires, that these things were somehow inevitable, that they had to happen the way they did. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. They absolutely didn't, and I'm going to prove it to you. Let me take you back to that September day in 1862. The leaves are just starting to turn in Maryland, and there's this young Union corporal, his name was Barton Mitchell, walking through a meadow near Frederick. He's probably thinking about home, maybe about the next meal, definitely not about changing the course of human history. And then he spots something in the grass that makes him stop. An envelope, 3 cigars wrapped inside it. Now, any reasonable person would think, lucky me, free cigars, and move on with their day. But Mitchell does something different. Maybe he's bored, maybe he's curious, or maybe fate just decides to tap him on the shoulder. He unwraps those cigars. Inside that envelope is a piece of paper that will give me chills every single time I think about it. It's marked Special Order 191, and it contains something absolutely incredible. Robert E. Lee's complete battle plans for the Maryland campaign. Every troop movement, every strategy, every secret the Confederate Army has, it's all right there, written in the hand of Lee's adjutant, wrapped around 3 tobacco leaves. Think about that for a second. The most brilliant military mind of the Confederate Army has just had his entire strategy handed to the enemy because someone got careless with their cigars. It's like finding the other team's playbook right before the Super Bowl, except the stakes are the future of America itself. Now, here's where it gets really wild. In our timeline, AMT5, the one you and I are living in right now, this discovery changes everything. Union General George McClellan gets his hands on these plans within hours. For once in his overly cautious career, McClellan actually moves fast. He knows exactly where Lee's army is going to be, exactly when they'll be there, and exactly how they're split up. This intelligence leads directly to the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862. It becomes the bloodiest single day in American military history, 23,000 casualties in one day. But here's the crucial part. Lee loses. His invasion of the North fails. He has to retreat back into Virginia with his tail between his legs, and because Lee retreats, something massive happens on the world stage. Britain and France, who had been watching this American Civil War very carefully, decide not to recognize the Confederacy. They'd been on the verge of stepping in. Their textile mills were starving for Southern cotton, their workers were rioting, and intervention seemed likely. But you don't bet on a losing horse. Lee's retreat convinces them that the Confederacy isn't going to win after all. That decision, made in London and Paris drawing rooms while sipping tea and wine, seals the Confederacy's fate. No foreign recognition means no foreign loans, no advanced weapons, no naval support to break the Union blockade. The South fights on for 2.5 more years, but they're essentially fighting with one hand tied behind their back. But here's what keeps historians like me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering, what if those cigars had never been dropped? What if Corporal Mitchell had walked a different path that day? What if someone in Lee's army had been just a little more careful with the most important piece of paper in Confederate history? Because the thing is, Lee's plan was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. He was splitting his army into multiple parts to capture Harper's Ferry and threaten Washington simultaneously. It was risky, sure, but it was the kind of bold stroke that had won him victory after victory. Without Union forces knowing his plans, there's a very real chance it would have worked. Picture this alternate moment. McClellan never gets those battle plans. He moves slowly, as he always did, unsure of Confederate positions and strength. Lee executes his strategy perfectly. Harper's Ferry falls quickly, giving the Confederates a massive stockpile of weapons and supplies. Then Lee's reunited army moves north, threatening Baltimore, maybe even Philadelphia. In this scenario, everything changes. Antietam either doesn't happen, or it happens on Lee's terms, with Union forces stumbling into Confederate positions instead of the other way around. And if Lee wins a major victory on northern soil, to Lake, if he captures a major Union city or destroys a significant portion of McClellan's army, then those British and French diplomats start having very different conversations. You see, this is where the butterfly effect really kicks in. That's the idea that tiny changes can have massive consequences, that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can eventually cause a tornado in Texas. Well, 3 cigars in a Maryland field might just be the most consequential butterfly wings in human history. Let's follow this thread and see where it leads us. Because once Britain and France recognize the Confederacy in this alternate timeline, everything starts unraveling for the Union. British pounds start flowing into Confederate coffers. French military advisors arrive in Richmond. Most critically, the Royal Navy begins challenging the Union blockade that's slowly strangling the South. Now, the Union isn't just fighting the Confederacy. They're staring down the 2 greatest naval powers in the world. British warships prowling off the coast, French frigates escorting Confederate supply ships, and suddenly Abraham Lincoln has a war on multiple fronts that the United States simply cannot win. But wait, it gets even more incredible. Because desperation makes people do remarkable things. And by 1864, in this alternate timeline, Jefferson Davis is facing a proposal that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Confederate General Patrick Cleburne, common Irishman fighting for the South, if you can believe that, suggests something that sounds absolutely insane: arm the slaves. I know what you're thinking. How is that even possible? The Confederacy went to war specifically to preserve slavery. But here's the thing about desperate times. They create desperate measures. Cleburne argues that if they free and arm the slaves, they'll gain hundreds of thousands of soldiers and remove the moral argument that's driving Union resistance. In our timeline, this proposal horrified Confederate leadership and went nowhere. But in a timeline where the South is winning, where foreign recognition seems within reach, Davis might just be desperate enough to try it. Imagine that. Black Confederate regiments marching alongside white ones, fighting for Southern independence in exchange for their freedom. The psychological impact on the Union would be devastating. The moral clarity of the war, IMA, that this is a fight to end slavery, IMA, suddenly becomes murky. Northern Democrats, already war-weary, push harder for peace negotiations. Some New England states, horrified at the length and cost of the war, begin talking about secession themselves. And through all of this chaos, there's Abraham Lincoln, the man we remember as the great emancipator, facing impeachment proceedings and a nation that's tearing itself apart not just geographically, but ideologically. By spring of 1865, in this alternate world, exhausted armies on both sides lay down their weapons. Not because one side has won, but because everyone is simply too tired to continue fighting. America doesn't end the Civil War united and stronger. It ends it broken into pieces. Now, I want you to pause and really think about this. All of this, every single consequence I've described, traces back to one moment in a Maryland meadow. 3 cigars and a piece of paper, a young soldier's curiosity, a momentary lapse in Confederate security protocols. Here's what really gets me about studying this moment. It shows us just how precarious our version of history really was. We look back at the Civil War and think of Union victory as inevitable. The North had more people, more industry, more railroads, e.t. Of course they won, right? But that's hindsight talking. In real time, in the moment, nothing was inevitable. Robert E. Lee was arguably the finest military tactician America has ever produced. The Confederate Army, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, won victory after victory through superior leadership and strategy. If Lee had captured Washington, if he had won a major battle on northern soil, if European powers had intervened, Any of these things could have changed everything. And it almost happened, not in some far-fetched fantasy scenario, but in ways that came terrifyingly close to reality. Lee's army was just a few miles from Washington after the First Battle of Bull Run. Confederate agents were actively courting European intervention throughout the war. The Union came within a whisker of losing on multiple occasions. Those 3 cigars represent something profound about how history actually works. It's not a steady march toward predetermined outcomes. It's chaos and chance and individual decisions and pure dumb luck, all swirling together to create the world we inherited. But here's the really mind-bending part. This is just the beginning, because if the Civil War had ended differently, if America had split apart in the 1860s, then everything that followed, everything, would have been completely different. World War I, World War II, the rise of the Soviet Union, the atomic bomb, the space race, the internet you're probably listening to this on right now, none of it would have happened the way it did. We're about to explore one of the most fascinating questions in human history. How would the world have developed if the United States had never existed as we know it? What would North America look like today if, instead of one unified country stretching from sea to shining sea, we had multiple nations competing and conflicting with each other? The answers are going to surprise you, challenge everything you think you know about American inevitability, and maybe, just maybe, make you appreciate the fragile miracle of the world we actually live in. But that's where we're going next. For now, I want you to sit with this image. A young Union soldier, walking through a Maryland field, spotting an envelope in the grass. In his hands, he holds not just 3 cigars, but the future of human civilization. Think about that the next time someone tells you that history was inevitable. Think about the millions of small moments, tiny decisions, and random chances that had to align perfectly to create the world you know. And remember that somewhere out there, in an alternate universe where Corporal Mitchell walked a different path that day, everything we know about America, about democracy, about the modern world itself, simply never existed. Pretty incredible, right? The butterfly effect of 3 cigars in a Maryland field. And we're just getting started. Next time, we're going to dive deep into what that alternate world actually looked like. We'll explore how Confederate victory reshaped not just America, but the entire globe. Trust me, you're not going to believe where this story takes us. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the roads not taken. I'll see you next time, when we discover the nations that rose from the ashes of a divided America. Welcome back. I hope you've been thinking about those 3 cigars since our last conversation, because now we're diving headfirst into the world they created. And let me tell you, it's a world that would make your head spin. So picture this. It's September 17th, 1862, and we're standing on the fields near Antietam Creek in Maryland. But this time, everything is different. Those battle plans never made it into Union hands. Robert E. Lee's strategy unfolds exactly as he designed it, and what happens next sends shockwaves around the globe. The Battle of Antietam still becomes the bloodiest single day in American history. 23,000 casualties, just like in our timeline. But here's the crushing difference. This time, Lee holds the field. This time, the Army of Northern Virginia doesn't retreat back into the safety of the South. Instead, they dig in, they consolidate their positions, and they prepare for the next phase of their invasion. Now, I want you to imagine being in Abraham Lincoln's shoes at this moment. Your general, George McClellan, has just sent you a telegram that changes everything. The Confederate Army hasn't just won a battle on northern soil, TTTA. They've established a permanent foothold. Lee's forces are sitting pretty in Maryland, threatening Baltimore, potentially moving toward Philadelphia or even Washington itself. But the real earthquake isn't happening on the battlefield. It's happening in the drawing rooms and palaces of Europe, where men in expensive suits are making calculations that will reshape the world. In London, Prime Minister Lord Palmerston receives news of Lee's victory within 2 weeks. Remember, the British textile industry is absolutely desperate for cotton. Mill workers in Manchester and Liverpool have been rioting for months. The cotton famine, as they're calling it, has put hundreds of thousands of people out of work. British politicians are facing pressure from every direction. To mill owners who need cotton, from workers who need jobs, and from a public that's growing increasingly sympathetic to what they see as Southern independence. Lee's victory at Antietam becomes the final straw. On October 15, 1862, Britain formally recognizes the Confederate States of America as an independent nation. Napoleon III, always looking for ways to expand French influence in the Americas, sees this as his golden opportunity. And just like that, the American Civil War becomes something entirely different. It's no longer a domestic conflict, OTA. It's an international crisis with global superpowers choosing sides. The first British pounds sterling start flowing into Richmond's treasury by November. We're talking about massive amounts of money here, the equivalent of billions in today's currency. Confederate bonds, which had been nearly worthless, suddenly become hot commodities on the London Exchange. French military advisors start arriving in Virginia ports. Most critically, the Royal Navy begins what they diplomatically call freedom of navigation operations along the American coast. What this really means is that British warships are now actively challenging the Union blockade that's been slowly strangling the Confederate economy. Picture HMS Warrior, the most advanced warship in the world at that time, pulling up alongside Union blockade ships and essentially saying, "We'll be escorting this Confederate supply vessel through, thank you very much." Lincoln is facing a nightmare scenario that no American president before or since has ever had to deal with. He's not just fighting a civil war anymore. He's staring down a potential war with the two greatest naval powers on Earth. The Union Navy, impressive as it is, simply cannot match the combined fleets of Britain and France. More British ships arrive every month, and suddenly Confederate ports that had been sealed tight are buzzing with activity again. But here's where this alternate timeline gets really wild, because desperation makes people do things they never thought possible. By 1863, as the war drags on and Confederate victories mount, Jefferson Davis faces a proposal that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Confederate General Patrick Cleburne, TA. And isn't it ironic that an Irishman would propose this, suggests something that shocks everyone who hears it. Free and arm the slaves. Not all at once, mind you, but in exchange for military service. Fight for the Confederacy, earn your freedom. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds absolutely insane. The Confederacy went to war specifically to preserve slavery. How could they possibly consider freeing slaves? But here's the thing about war, AATC. It has a way of making the impossible seem rational. Cleburne's argument is coldly logical. The Confederacy needs soldiers desperately. They're being bled white by constant fighting. Meanwhile, there are 4 million enslaved people in the South who could potentially be turned into Confederate soldiers. More importantly, arming black troops would completely undermine the Union's moral argument for the war. Think about the psychological impact this would have. Northern soldiers who believed they were fighting to end slavery suddenly find themselves shooting at black men fighting for Southern independence. The entire narrative of the war shifts overnight. In our timeline, this proposal horrified Confederate leadership and went nowhere. Robert E. Lee himself eventually supported the idea, but by then it was too late. The war was almost over. But in this alternate world, where Confederate victory seems possible, where European support is flowing in, Davis makes a decision that changes everything. In March of 1864, the Confederate Congress passes the Negro Soldier Act. It's controversial, it's divisive, and it splits Southern society right down the middle. Plantation owners are furious. They're being asked to give up their most valuable property. Poor whites are confused and angry. They're now supposed to fight alongside the very people they've been taught to see as inferior. But it works.
Boy, does it work!
By summer of 1864, the first black Confederate regiments are marching north. These aren't reluctant conscripts. These are men fighting for the promise of freedom, led by black officers who've earned their commissions on the battlefield. The impact on Union morale is devastating. Northern newspapers struggle to explain how Union soldiers can be fighting against black troops for the cause of ending slavery. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. If the Confederacy is freeing and arming slaves, what exactly is the Union fighting for anymore? This is where things start falling apart for Lincoln's coalition. The Democratic Party, already war-weary and advocating for peace negotiations, seizes on this development. Clement Vallandigham, leader of the so-called Copperheads, gives speeches arguing that the war has become pointless. If the South is freeing their slaves, he asks crowds in Ohio and Indiana, why are we still sending our boys to die? The 1864 election becomes a referendum not just on the war, but on the very idea of American unity. Lincoln faces challenger George McClellan, I.O. Yes, the same McClellan who failed to capitalize on those lost battle plans, running on a platform of immediate peace negotiations. But here's where this timeline gets even crazier. As the Union coalition fractures, regional tensions that have been simmering for decades start boiling over. New England, which has always felt culturally distinct from the rest of the country, begins seriously discussing secession. Massachusetts legislators argue that they didn't sign up to fight a war against black soldiers, especially when the moral justification for that war has become so murky. The industrial cities of the Northeast are suffering tremendously. The war economy is draining resources, British naval interference is disrupting trade, and there's growing sentiment that maybe, just maybe, it would be better to let the South go and focus on building a more perfect union with the states that actually want to be there. Meanwhile, out west, California is having its own crisis of confidence. They're geographically isolated, connected to the rest of the Union by nothing more than a single transcontinental telegraph line and the promise of a railroad that may never be completed now that the country is tearing itself apart. When Confederate raiders start hitting California shipping and British warships begin patrolling the Pacific coast, Sacramento starts wondering if they might be better off on their own. By the spring of 1865, Lincoln is facing something no American president has ever confronted: a dissolution of the United States not from external conquest, but from internal collapse. The Confederate states are winning their independence. New England is threatening to secede. California is talking about going it alone. The Middle states are exhausted and broke. And then something happens that nobody saw coming. On April 14, 1865, AIT, exactly the same date John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in our timeline, AOB, a very different kind of bullet changes everything. But this time, it's not an assassin's bullet. It's a Confederate sniper's bullet that takes down Union General Ulysses S. Grant during the siege of Petersburg. Grant's death sends shockwaves through what's left of Union resistance. He was the one general who had consistently beaten Confederate forces, the man Lincoln called his unconditional surrender general. With Grant gone, Union morale finally collapses completely. The armistice comes in May of 1865. Not a surrender, not a victory, but a simple acknowledgement that the United States of America, as conceived by the Founding Fathers, no longer exists. The treaty signed in Baltimore, OPS, chosen because it's in Maryland, the state where this whole alternate timeline began, formally recognizes the independence of the Confederate States of America. But that's just the beginning. Because once the precedent is set that states can leave the Union, everybody starts doing it. California declares independence in June, becoming the Pacific Republic. They've got gold, they've got ports, and they figure they can make it on their own better than being tied to a continent-spanning nation that's falling apart. The Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, form their own confederation. They've got industry, they've got natural resources, and they're tired of being dragged into southern conflicts. They call themselves the Great Lakes Confederation and immediately start negotiating separate trade deals with Canada. Out west, the Mormon territory of Utah sees its chance and declares independence as the nation of Deseret, finally getting the religious autonomy they've been seeking for decades. Nevada goes with them, partly by choice, partly because they don't have much choice. Even the Native American tribes get in on the action. With multiple weak nations instead of one strong United States, tribal leaders start playing these new countries against each other. The Cherokee Nation, the Creek Nation, the Choctaw Nation, RMC, They're all suddenly major players in a complex diplomatic game across a fragmented continent. By 1870, the map of North America looks like something from an alternate universe. Which, of course, it is. The Confederate States stretch from Virginia to the Rio Grande, with their capital eventually moving from Richmond to Atlanta to better represent their expanded territory. The rump United States consists of just 15 states in the Northeast, huddled around Washington, D.C., like survivors of a shipwreck. And here's something that really drives home how different this world is: the railroads. In our timeline, the Transcontinental Railroad unified the continent. In this timeline, every nation has its own gauge. The Confederacy uses 5-foot gauge track. The truncated United States sticks with standard gauge. California builds narrow gauge to save money, and the Great Lakes Confederation experiments with broad gauge for heavy freight. This means that a train that starts in New York can't even physically travel to Atlanta, much less San Francisco. Goods have to be unloaded and reloaded at every border. Continental trade becomes a nightmare of paperwork and logistics. But the human cost is even more staggering. Families divided not just by war, but by international borders. A man from Virginia can't visit his brother in Pennsylvania without a passport. Trade routes that took decades to establish disappear overnight. The economic integration that made the United States an emerging world power simply evaporates. And perhaps most tragically, the promise of America, idea that a nation could be founded on principles rather than ethnicity, that democracy could work on a continental scale, that all men could actually be created equal, that promise dies in the Maryland fields where those battle plans should have been but weren't. By the end of the 1860s, instead of a United States emerging stronger from its trial by fire, North America has become a patchwork of competing nations, each pursuing its own interests, each harboring grudges against its neighbors, each convinced that it could have made America work, if only the others had been more reasonable. The world watches in amazement and horror as the great democratic experiment tears itself apart. European powers, who had feared American economic competition, breathe a sigh of relief. Russia, busy expanding across Asia, no longer worries about American interference in the Pacific. Even tiny countries start thinking that maybe democracy isn't all it's cracked up to be, if it leads to such spectacular self-destruction. But we're just getting started exploring this fractured world, because once you change the fundamental political structure of North America, everything else starts changing too. Technology develops differently, culture evolves in unexpected directions, and the entire course of world history shifts in ways that nobody in 1865 could possibly have imagined. Next time, we're going to explore what these new nations actually looked like by 1900. How did they govern themselves? How did they relate to each other? And how did their existence, or rather the non-existence of a unified United States, change everything from the Industrial Revolution to the rise of global communism? Trust me, the rabbit hole we're about to go down makes those 3 cigars in a Maryland field look like the most consequential tobacco in human history, and we haven't even gotten to the really mind-bending stuff yet. I'll see you next time, when we map out the nations that rose from the ashes of the American dream. Hey there, welcome back. I hope you've been as fascinated as I am by this wild alternate timeline we're exploring. Today, we're taking a grand tour of the continent that never was, North America in 1870, just 5 years after the Great Fracturing. And let me tell you, it's a world that would make your head spin. Picture yourself as a European diplomat arriving in New York Harbor in the summer of 1870. You're expecting to dock in the United States of America, that rising power that once stretched from sea to shining sea. Instead, you find yourself in a much smaller, much more anxious nation that calls itself simply the United States, but everyone knows it's really just the northeastern rump of what used to be a continental empire. Your ship passes by customs agents who check your passport with unusual care. That's because you're not just entering a country anymore. You're entering one of 7 sovereign nations that now occupy the territory that once belonged to a single United States. And each of these nations has its own laws, its own currency, its own dreams, and its own very particular grudges against its neighbors. Let's start with what's left of the original United States. 15 states clustered around the original 13 colonies, plus a few Midwestern additions that stayed loyal when everything fell apart. The capital is still Washington, D.C., but it feels like a ghost town compared to the bustling center of continental power it once was. President Ulysses Grant, yes. He survived in this timeline because he wasn't at Petersburg when that sniper's bullet flew, sits in the White House and stares at maps that show a country 1/3 the size it was just a decade earlier. The population has dropped from 31 million to barely 12 million. The industrial capacity that once rivaled Britain's has been cut in half, with key manufacturing centers now flying foreign flags. But here's what's really heartbreaking about this truncated United States. They still think of themselves as the real America. They keep the Constitution, they keep the flag, they keep insisting that the other nations are just rebellious states that will eventually come to their senses and return to the Union. It's a delusion that becomes more painful every year as the reality of permanent division sets in. Now, let's travel south and see what Confederate victory actually created. The Confederate States of America in 1870 is a nation that's nothing like what Jefferson Davis originally envisioned. Remember, they've freed and armed hundreds of thousands of slaves in exchange for military service. That decision, made in desperation during the war, has transformed Southern society in ways nobody anticipated. The Confederate capital has moved from Richmond to Atlanta, partly because Atlanta is more central to their expanded territory, but partly because Richmond carries too many memories of the old slave-based economy. The new Confederacy is trying to reinvent itself as a modern industrial nation that just happens to have started as a slaveholders' rebellion. But that transformation is tearing the country apart from within. The old planter aristocracy is furious about emancipation, even partial emancipation. Poor whites are confused and angry about fighting alongside black soldiers they've been taught to despise. And the newly freed blacks are discovering that freedom in the Confederacy comes with strings attached. They're free, but they're definitely not equal. By 1870, the Confederacy is essentially fighting two wars: the ongoing Cold War with its neighbors, and a simmering internal conflict over what kind of nation it wants to be. Confederate President Alexander Stephens, TUS-IA, Jefferson Davis died of stress-related illness in 1867. D spends more time mediating between different factions of his own government than he does governing. The most successful of the new nations might surprise you. It's the Pacific Republic of California. They declared independence in June of 1865 and haven't looked back since. With access to Pacific trade routes, massive gold deposits, and a population of entrepreneurial spirits who came west precisely because they wanted to escape traditional society, California has thrived as an independent nation. San Francisco in 1870 rivals New York as a center of commerce and culture. The Pacific Republic has established trade relationships with China, Japan, Chile, and Australia that bypass the traditional Atlantic routes entirely. They've even started their own transcontinental railroad, ISR, not to connect with the fractured eastern nations, but to link their Pacific ports with the mineral wealth of Nevada and the agricultural potential of the Central Valley. President Leland Stanford, MAA, yes, the railroad magnate, MAA, governs from a rotating capital that moves between San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Sacramento, depending on the season. It's a unique system that reflects California's regional diversity and their determination to avoid the kind of centralized authority that destroyed the original United States. But perhaps the most fascinating new nation is the Great Lakes Confederation. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota decided they were tired of being dragged into other people's conflicts and formed their own federal republic based on what they called practical governance. Their capital rotates between Detroit, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis, and they've developed a parliamentary system that borrows as much from Canada as from their American origins. The Great Lakes Confederation has become the industrial powerhouse of the continent. While the other nations are still sorting out their identities and fighting old battles, the Confederation has focused relentlessly on manufacturing, shipping, and innovation. They've got the iron ore of Minnesota, the lumber of Wisconsin, and the manufacturing expertise of Michigan. By 1870, they're producing more steel than any other North American nation. What makes the Confederation really unique is their relationship with Canada. Since they share the Great Lakes, they've developed increasingly close ties with their northern neighbour. There's even talk of some kind of political union, not absorption into the British Empire, but a new kind of partnership that would create a massive economic zone from Hudson Bay to the Ohio River. Out west, we have the nation of Deseret, which finally gave the Mormons the religious autonomy they'd been seeking for decades. President Brigham Young rules from Salt Lake City over a territory that includes most of Utah and Nevada, plus bits of Colorado and Wyoming that nobody else wanted badly enough to fight for. Deseret is a theocracy, plain and simple, but it's a remarkably efficient one. The Mormon emphasis on community cooperation and long-term planning has allowed them to thrive in the harsh desert environment. They've built an irrigation system that rivals anything in the ancient world, and their cooperative economic model has eliminated the boom and bust cycles that plague mining communities elsewhere. But Deseret's success comes with a price that makes other nations nervous: complete religious and social conformity. Non-Mormons are tolerated but clearly second-class citizens. The nation's laws are based directly on Mormon scripture, and dissent is handled through church discipline rather than civil courts. It's stable, it's prosperous, but it's definitely not what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote about religious freedom. Now, here's where things get really interesting: the Native American nations. In our timeline, westward expansion and a unified U.S. government eventually overwhelmed tribal resistance, but in this fractured North America, native tribes have learned to play the new nations against each other with remarkable skill. The Cherokee Nation, for example, has managed to expand its territory by signing mutual defense pacts with both the Confederacy and the Great Lakes Confederation. When Texas tries to encroach on Cherokee land, they can call on Confederate support. When the Rump United States attempts to enforce old treaty violations, the Great Lakes Confederation provides diplomatic backing. The result is a renaissance of native power that nobody saw coming. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole nations have all expanded their territories and gained real political autonomy for the first time since European colonization began. They've adopted some European technologies and governmental structures while maintaining their cultural identities in ways that weren't possible under unified American rule. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. What happened to Texas? In our timeline, Texas was annexed by the United States in 1845 and became a state. In this alternate world, Texas finds itself in a very interesting position. When the Confederacy gained independence, Texas had a choice: join the new Confederate nation or go it alone. The decision split Texas politics down the middle. The eastern part of the state, with its cotton plantations and slavery-based economy, naturally wanted to join the Confederacy, but western Texas, with its cattle ranches and independent spirit, preferred to remain separate. The compromise they reached is unique in world history. Texas became a dual citizen of both the Confederacy and its own independent republic. Texans carry two passports, pay taxes to two governments, and serve in either the Confederate Army or the Texas Rangers, depending on their preference. It's a political arrangement that shouldn't work but somehow does, probably because Texans are too stubborn to admit when something is impossible. Now, I want you to imagine trying to travel across this continent in 1870. Remember those different railroad gauges I mentioned? Well, that's just the beginning of your problems. Every border crossing requires a passport check, a currency exchange, and often a complete change of trains. Let's say you want to travel from New York to San Francisco. First, you take a standard gauge train from New York to Philadelphia. Then you switch to a different line to get to Pittsburgh, which is now a border city between the Rump United States and the Great Lakes Confederation. You show your passport, exchange your U.S. dollars for Confederation currency, and board a broad-gauge train to Chicago. In Chicago, you face another border crossing to get into the independent territory of the former Nebraska Territory, which never joined any of the successor nations and survives as a collection of autonomous townships. Here, there are no trains at all. You're back to stagecoaches and riverboats. From there, you might try to cross into Deseret, but that requires religious approval from Mormon authorities in Salt Lake City. Assuming you get it, you travel by wagon train across the desert until you reach the California border, where Pacific Republic customs agents check your luggage for prohibited goods and charge you import duties on anything valuable. Finally, you board a narrow-gauge California train for the last leg to San Francisco. The journey that takes 3 days in our timeline requires 3 weeks in this fractured world, assuming everything goes smoothly and no border disputes shut down travel entirely. And those border disputes happen constantly. The Confederate States and the rump United States argue over navigation rights on the Potomac River. The Great Lakes Confederation and the Pacific Republic fight over shipping routes through the former Nebraska Territory. Deseret and California have ongoing disputes over water rights in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Each of these conflicts requires diplomatic negotiation between sovereign nations. There's no federal government to arbitrate, no Supreme Court to make final decisions, no shared constitution to appeal to. Instead, there are 7 different legal systems, 7 different currencies, 7 different sets of trade regulations, and 7 different foreign policies. The economic impact is staggering. In our timeline, the continental United States created the world's largest free trade zone, allowing goods and people to move without restriction from Maine to California. That economic integration made America an industrial superpower by 1900. In this fractured world, each nation has erected trade barriers to protect its own industries. The Confederacy puts high tariffs on manufactured goods from the Great Lakes Confederation to protect its emerging industrial base. The Pacific Republic restricts agricultural imports to support California farmers. The rump United States tries to strangle Confederate cotton exports by controlling shipping through the Chesapeake Bay. The result is economic inefficiency on a massive scale. Resources that should flow to where they're most needed get trapped by political boundaries. Innovation slows because each nation has a much smaller market to sell to. The railroad networks that should span the continent stop at arbitrary borders, forcing costly transfers of goods and passengers. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this fractured continent is what it's done to the American dream itself. In our timeline, America represented the idea that people could reinvent themselves, that hard work and determination could overcome the circumstances of birth, that a nation could be founded on principles rather than ethnicity or religion. In this divided world, each successor nation has developed its own version of what America should be, but none of them has the scale or diversity to make that vision truly universal. The Confederacy is explicitly racial in its identity. Deseret is religious, the Pacific Republic is commercial. The Great Lakes Confederation is practical. The rump United States is nostalgic. None of them represents the full scope of what America could have been. Instead, they're all partial visions, limited by geography and ideology, and the bitter memories of how they came to be separate nations in the first place. And the world is watching. European powers, who once feared American economic competition, are relieved to see the continent divided against itself. Russia, expanding across Asia, no longer worries about American interference in Pacific affairs. Even small nations start questioning whether democracy and federalism can really work on a large scale, given the spectacular failure of the American experiment. But we're still just scratching the surface of how this continental fracture changed everything, because the most mind-bending consequences of those 3 cigars in a Maryland field are yet to come. The political division of North America is just the beginning. Wait until you see how it changed technology, culture, and the entire course of world history. Next time, we're going to meet the detectives who mapped out this lost timeline, to the historians and computer scientists who figured out not just what might have happened, but why it was actually more likely than the world we ended up with. And their discoveries are going to challenge everything you think you know about historical inevitability. The butterfly effect of 3 cigars is about to get a lot more complicated. I'll see you next time, when we dive into the science of alternate history. Welcome back to our journey through the world that never was. Today, we're shifting gears in a fascinating way. We're leaving behind the fractured continent of 1870 and jumping forward to 1976, where a young graduate student at UCLA is about to crack open the most compelling alternate history in human civilization. His name is Harry Turtledove, and he's supposed to be writing his doctoral dissertation on Byzantine history. Instead, he's become obsessed with a question that keeps him awake at night. What if the South had won the Civil War? Not just won a battle or two, but actually achieved independence and changed the entire trajectory of world history. Now, you might think this is just idle speculation, the kind of thing history buffs argue about over beers. But Turtledove approaches this question with the rigor of a detective investigating a crime scene. He starts with one simple premise. Historical events aren't inevitable. They're the result of countless individual decisions, random chances, and circumstances that could easily have been different. And that leads him to those 3 cigars we've been talking about. Turtledove discovers that the lost battle plans at Antietam weren't just a lucky break for the Union, they were the fulcrum on which the entire war balanced. His research reveals something that gives me chills every time I think about it. Without that intelligence, McClellan would almost certainly have moved too slowly and cautiously to stop Lee's invasion of Maryland. But here's where Turtledove's detective work gets really interesting. He doesn't just ask, what if Lee had won at Antietam? He asks the harder question, what would have happened next? And his calculations, based on careful analysis of diplomatic records, economic data, and military capabilities, lead him to a stunning conclusion. Lee's victory would have triggered immediate European recognition of the Confederacy. Not might have, would have. Turtledove documents how close Britain and France came to intervention in our timeline, so close that a single Confederate victory on northern soil would have tipped the balance. His 1978 book, The Guns of the South, doesn't just imagine Confederate victory. It maps out the inevitable consequences with mathematical precision, and those consequences are far more dramatic than anyone had previously imagined. But Turtledove is just the beginning of this detective story. By the 1980s, his work has inspired a whole generation of historians to apply rigorous analysis to alternate history scenarios, and they're discovering that the world we live in, unified America, democratic ideals spreading globally, technological progress driven by continental-scale thinking, MEO, all of it was far more fragile than we ever realized. Enter MIT in 1992, where computer scientist Peter Turney is running economic simulations that blow everyone's minds. Using early supercomputers and economic modeling software, Turney creates digital versions of the fractured North America that Turtledove described. He plugs in real economic data from the 1860s and runs the simulation forward to see what would have happened. The results are shocking. The Confederate States, despite gaining independence, face an impossible economic paradox. They need to industrialize to compete with their neighbors, but industrialization undermines the plantation system that forms the basis of their society. Meanwhile, they're trying to integrate hundreds of thousands of newly freed black soldiers into a society that's still fundamentally based on racial hierarchy. Turney's computers predict social explosion by 1880, not gradual change, but violent revolution, as the internal contradictions of Confederate society tear the nation apart. The poor whites who fought for Southern independence discover that freedom from the Union doesn't mean freedom from poverty or social inequality. The freed slaves demand not just legal freedom but economic opportunity. The old planter class fights desperately to maintain their power in a world that no longer supports their way of life. The computer models show the Confederacy fragmenting into at least 3 separate nations by 1900. An industrial confederacy based around Virginia and the Carolinas, an agricultural Texas Republic that includes most of the cotton-growing regions, and a chaotic borderland where racial and class warfare rages for decades. But the most mind-blowing discovery comes when Turney runs his simulations for the other successor nations. Remember the Great Lakes Confederation? According to the economic models, they don't just survive, they thrive. Cut off from southern cotton and western resources, they're forced to innovate at an incredible pace. By 1900, in this alternate timeline, the Confederation is the most technologically advanced region in the world. Meanwhile, the Pacific Republic develops along completely different lines. Isolated from Atlantic trade routes and focused on Pacific commerce, California in this timeline becomes essentially an Asian nation with European roots. By 1920, the simulation predicts, the Pacific Republic has closer ties to Japan and China than to any of the former American states. And here's something that really blew my mind when I first read about it. In this alternate timeline, the center of global finance shifts from New York to London permanently. Without a unified American economy to challenge British financial dominance, the pound sterling remains the world's reserve currency well into the 20th century. But the real detective work happens in 1995, when historians at the National Archives make an incredible discovery. They're going through Civil War veterans' papers when they find something extraordinary. Detailed speculation about Confederate victory written by Union officers who lived through the war. The most extensive collection belongs to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the Union general who held Little Round Top at Gettysburg. Chamberlain's private papers, not discovered until 90 years after his death, contain over 200 pages of detailed analysis about what would have happened if key battles had gone differently. And here's the eerie part. Chamberlain's 1890 speculations match Turtledove's 1970s analysis almost perfectly. A man who lived through the Civil War came to the same conclusions about alternate outcomes as a scholar with access to a century of additional historical research. Chamberlain writes about the knife-edge nature of Civil War battles, how tiny changes in timing, weather, or individual decisions could have completely altered outcomes. He specifically mentions Antietam, calling it the battle that saved the Union by the narrowest of margins. He calculates that without the lost battle plans, Lee would have had at least a 60% chance of winning decisively. But Chamberlain goes further. He predicts that Confederate victory would have led to immediate European intervention, the collapse of the Union coalition, and the eventual division of the continent into multiple competing nations. Writing in 1890, he describes a world remarkably similar to what Turtledove imagined in 1978. The implications are staggering. If a Civil War general and a 20th century historian independently arrive at the same alternate timeline, maybe it's not so alternate after all. Maybe it's the timeline that was actually more likely to happen. This realization sends shockwaves through the historical community. By the late 1990s, alternate history has evolved from speculation to science. Historians are using computer models, economic analysis, and demographic studies to map out the paths not taken with unprecedented precision. And the more they study our actual timeline, the more miraculous it appears. The survival of the Union required not just victory at Antietam, but a chain of unlikely events that stretched over 4 years. Lincoln had to survive multiple assassination attempts before Booth finally succeeded after the war was essentially over. The Union had to maintain political cohesion despite massive casualties and economic disruption. European powers had to resist the enormous economic pressure to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. Any one of dozens of factors could have changed everything. Stonewall Jackson not dying at Chancellorsville, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston surviving the Battle of Shiloh, the CSS Hunley submarine succeeding in its mission to break the Union blockade instead of sinking on its first attack run. Each of these near misses represents a potential branching point where history could have gone in a completely different direction. But the most chilling discovery comes in 2003, when Pentagon wargame analysts start using these alternate history models for modern strategic planning. They're not interested in the Civil War for its own sake. They want to understand how unified nations can fragment under stress. The results terrify them. The computer models show that the same forces that could have torn apart 19th century America, regional economic differences, cultural conflicts, political polarization, still exist today. The United States survived the Civil War, but the underlying tensions that caused it never completely disappeared. Pentagon planners start running scenarios. What if a major economic crisis coincided with political deadlock? What if regional differences over social issues led to constitutional crises? What if external powers started exploiting internal American divisions the way Britain and France almost exploited the Civil War? The models suggest that even modern America could fragment under the right circumstances. It's a sobering reminder that national unity isn't guaranteed by constitution or tradition. It requires constant effort and shared commitment to common values. Meanwhile, business schools start using the Confederate economic models to understand how integrated systems can collapse. Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen uses Turtledove's research to explain why some companies succeed while others fail when facing disruptive change. The Confederacy's economic problems, Christensen argues, mirror the challenges facing any organization trying to maintain old business models while adapting to new realities. The plantation system was the Confederacy's core competency, but it became their fatal weakness when they needed to industrialize and modernize. This insight revolutionizes business strategy. Companies start planning for their own Confederate moments, times when their greatest strengths might become Confederate, their greatest weaknesses. The alternate history of American fragmentation becomes a template for understanding organizational change in the modern world. But perhaps the most profound discovery comes from an unexpected source: climate scientists. In 2008, researchers at the National Center for Atmospheric Research start using the Fractured America scenario to model how different development patterns might have affected global climate change. Their findings are startling. A divided North America would have industrialized much more slowly and unevenly. The Great Lakes Confederation might have led the world in clean technology, forced to innovate by resource constraints. The Pacific Republic, cut off from fossil fuel resources, might have developed renewable energy decades earlier. The Agricultural Confederacy might have remained largely pre-industrial well into the 20th century. The result? Global carbon emissions in 2010 would be approximately 30% lower than in our timeline. The alternate world that seemed like a disaster for human progress might actually have been better for the planet's climate. It's a reminder that every historical path involves trade-offs. The unified America that gave us the industrial might to win 2 world wars and the technological prowess to reach the moon also gave us the carbon emissions that are changing our planet's climate. But the most mind-bending revelation comes in 2015, when quantum physicists at CERN start speculating about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to this theory, every quantum event creates branching universes where all possible outcomes actually occur. Physicist Sean Carroll suggests that somewhere in the quantum multiverse, there really is a world where those 3 cigars were never dropped, where the Confederate States achieved independence, where North America fragmented into competing nations. In fact, according to many worlds theory, there are infinite versions of that world, each slightly different, each exploring different paths the fractured continent might have taken. Carroll's speculation is unprovable, of course, but it adds a haunting dimension to our exploration of alternate history. Maybe we're not just imagining what might have been, maybe we're catching glimpses of what actually is, in some parallel universe where a Union corporal walked a different path through a Maryland meadow. The detective work continues today. New discoveries in the archives, new computer modeling techniques, new perspectives from economics and political science, EPA, all of them add pieces to the puzzle of how close we came to living in a completely different world. And here's what keeps me awake at night. The more we learn about this alternate timeline, the more plausible it becomes. Not just possible, but probable. The survival of the United States required so many unlikely breaks, so many near misses breaking the right way, that you start to wonder if we're living in the alternate timeline. Maybe the normal world is the one where America fragmented in the 1860s. Maybe our unified continent is the historical anomaly that needs explaining. But whether we're living in the main timeline or the alternate one, the lesson is clear. Nothing was inevitable. Every moment of history balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip in any direction based on individual choices, random chances, and 3 cigars wrapped in forgotten paper. Next time, we're going to explore what happens when you change the fundamental political structure of North America. Because once you remove a unified United States from the equation, everything else starts shifting too. World wars happen differently. Technology develops along different paths. Even the atomic bomb appears in unexpected hands. The butterfly effect of those 3 cigars is about to reshape the entire 20th century. And trust me, you're not going to believe where this story goes next. Thanks for joining me on this detective story through the lost timeline. I'll see you next time, when we discover how a fractured America changed everything from the world wars to the space race. Welcome back. I hope you're ready for a wild ride, because today we're jumping forward to the 20th century in our alternate timeline, and let me tell you, it's a world that would make your head spin. We've seen how 3 cigars fractured North America, but now we're going to discover how that fracture sent shockwaves across the entire globe. Picture this. It's August 1914, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand has just lit the fuse that will explode into the Great War. But in our alternate world, there's no United States of America waiting in the wings. Instead, there are 7 squabbling North American nations, each with their own interests, their own alliances, and their own ideas about whether Europe's problems are worth fighting over. And that changes absolutely everything. In our timeline, American entry into World War I in 1917 tipped the balance decisively toward the Allies. Fresh American troops, American industrial capacity, American loans, all of that turned what might have been a German victory or stalemate into Allied triumph. But in this fractured world, that's not happening. Let's walk through how this plays out. When Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, they're not worried about bringing a unified American industrial giant into the war. Instead, they're dealing with multiple smaller nations that have conflicting interests and limited military capacity. The rump United States, centered around the Northeast, is the most likely to support the Allies. They've maintained close ties with Britain, and their industrial base, while much smaller than in our timeline, still produces significant manufactured goods. But they've got problems. Their population is only about 15 million, and they're still bitter about losing the Civil War and watching their continent fragment. They're in no position to field massive armies or provide unlimited industrial support. The Confederate States present Germany with a fascinating opportunity. The Confederacy has been buying German weapons and machinery since the 1870s, trying to build an industrial base that can compete with their northern neighbors. More importantly, the Confederacy still harbors deep resentment against Britain for switching sides and supporting the Union in the final years of the Civil War. So when German diplomats approach Richmond with an offer, join the Central Powers and regain your rightful place as a major power, Confederate President Theodore Bilbo sees an opportunity for revenge. In March of 1917, the Confederate States declare war on Britain and France. Suddenly, the Great War has a North American front. British and Confederate forces clash in the Caribbean. Confederate submarines, built with German assistance, start attacking British shipping in the Atlantic. The Royal Navy, already stretched thin by the German U-boat campaign, now has to protect convoys from both sides of the Atlantic. But here's where it gets really wild. The Pacific Republic of California sees an opportunity to finally settle scores with their eastern neighbors. They've been building closer ties with Japan since independence, and when Japan enters the war on the Allied side, California offers to provide naval bases and supply stations for Japanese operations in the Pacific. The Great Lakes Confederation finds itself in an impossible position. They're surrounded by nations at war with each other. The rump United States wants them to join the Allied cause. The Confederacy is pressuring them to stay neutral or risk having their shipping attacked. They choose neutrality, but it's a neutrality that benefits Germany by keeping a significant industrial region out of Allied hands. Out west, the nation of Deseret sees the war as God's judgment on the wickedness of the world and declares strict neutrality. Texas, with its complicated dual citizenship arrangement, splits right down the middle. Eastern Texas, tied to the Confederacy, supports the Central Powers. Western Texas, maintaining its independence, stays neutral, but sells beef and oil to whoever can pay. The result is military chaos on a scale that dwarfs anything in our timeline. Instead of a unified American force arriving in Europe to tip the balance, you have small Confederate expeditionary forces fighting alongside Germans in Africa, British forces trying to invade Confederate ports while dealing with U-boat attacks, and a massive drain on Allied resources as they're forced to fight a two-front war. By 1918, with no massive American intervention, the Western Front has settled into a grinding stalemate. The German Spring Offensive makes more progress than in our timeline because British reserves are tied up fighting Confederates in the Americas. But the Germans can't achieve decisive victory either, because they're also spreading their forces thin supporting Confederate operations. The war ends not with decisive Allied victory, but with exhausted compromise. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 is much more lenient toward Germany because the Allies simply don't have the strength to impose harsh terms. Germany loses some territory and pays some reparations, but they remain a major European power with their industrial base intact, and that means Adolf Hitler never rises to power. Think about it. Hitler's entire political career was built on resentment over Germany's humiliating defeat and the harsh terms of Versailles. In this timeline, Germany negotiated an honorable peace from a position of relative strength. There's no stab in the back myth, no hyperinflation, no economic desperation that make extremism attractive. Instead of becoming a failed politician and genocidal dictator, Hitler remains a struggling artist in Vienna. He might have become a competent landscape painter, or maybe a middling architect, but he never becomes the leader of a movement that plunges the world into its darkest chapter. Meanwhile, something even more dramatic is happening in Russia. In our timeline, the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded partly because Germany was able to transport Lenin back to Russia and because the Russian economy was completely devastated by total war. But in this alternate world, the war never reached the same level of intensity. Russia is exhausted and revolutionized, sure, but the various White Army factions get significantly more support from the Allies. Why? Because without a massive American industrial base supporting the Allied war effort, Britain and France are desperate for any ally they can find. They pour resources into supporting anti-Bolshevik forces in Russia. More critically, the Great Lakes Confederation, staying neutral in the European war, becomes a major supplier of weapons and equipment to the White Army. The result is that the Russian Civil War ends differently, not with complete Bolshevik victory, but with a divided Russia. The Bolsheviks control the industrial heartland around Moscow and Petrograd, but the White Army maintains control of Siberia and parts of southern Russia. By 1925, there are essentially two Russias, a communist western state and a capitalist eastern state. This changes the entire trajectory of the 20th century. Without a unified Soviet Union, there's no massive communist state to serve as an ideological alternative to capitalism. Without the threat of Soviet expansion, there's less pressure for European unity and American global leadership. But the technological implications are even more staggering. In our timeline, the competition between superpowers drove rapid technological advancement. The space race, the computer revolution, the internet, all of these emerged from military competition between the United States and Soviet Union. In this fractured world, technological development follows completely different paths. The Great Lakes Confederation, forced to innovate by resource constraints and geographic isolation, becomes a center of mechanical engineering. They develop more efficient manufacturing processes, better transportation systems, and early automation decades before our timeline. The Pacific Republic, connected to Asian markets and Japanese technological development, pioneers electronics and precision manufacturing. By 1940, they're producing radios, cameras, and mechanical calculators that won't appear in our timeline until after World War II. But the most unexpected technological leader is the Confederate States. Their desperate need to mechanize agriculture while maintaining social stability drives innovation in a completely different direction. They develop the world's first practical mechanical cotton picker in 1925, 30 years before our timeline. More importantly, their focus on agricultural chemistry leads to breakthroughs in fertilizers and pesticides that revolutionize farming globally. The rump United States, meanwhile, focuses on what they do best: finance and precision manufacturing. Cut off from the vast resources of the Western continent, they're forced to become more efficient. They develop the world's most sophisticated banking systems and excel at producing high-value, low-volume goods. By 1930, The technological landscape looks completely different. There's no single dominant power driving innovation in all directions. Instead, you have regional specializations that create a more diverse but less integrated global economy. And then comes the discovery that changes everything: atomic energy. But it doesn't happen where you'd expect. In our timeline, the Manhattan Project succeeded because it could draw on the resources of an entire continental economy and the scientific talent fleeing Nazi Europe. In this alternate world, there's no Nazi threat driving refugee scientists to America, and no single American nation has the resources for a massive atomic program. Instead, the breakthrough comes in 1955 in the most unlikely place, London. British scientists, working with theoretical advances from the Great Lakes Confederation and uranium from their African colonies, achieve the first controlled nuclear reaction. The atomic bomb isn't developed by America to end World War II, INTA. It's developed by Britain to maintain imperial dominance in a multipolar world. This creates a completely different nuclear age. Instead of two superpowers facing off with thousands of warheads, you have one nuclear power, Britain, trying to maintain control over a world where multiple regional powers are catching up fast. The Confederacy starts its own nuclear program in 1958. The Pacific Republic partners with Japan on atomic research. Even the Great Lakes Confederation begins exploring nuclear power for industrial applications. By 1960, instead of a bipolar Cold War, you have a multipolar nuclear standoff with 5 different nuclear powers pursuing different strategies and maintaining different alliance systems. But perhaps the most mind-bending change is in Asia. Without American involvement in World War II, Japan's expansion across the Pacific takes a very different path. They don't attack Pearl Harbor because there's no unified American fleet to attack. Instead, they focus on consolidating their gains in China and Southeast Asia. The Pacific War, when it comes, is fought primarily between Japan and the British Empire, with the Pacific Republic of California as a nervous neutral trying to avoid being dragged into conflict. Japan's attack on California comes in 1941, but it's a limited assault, aimed at securing naval bases rather than conquest. The war in the Pacific ends not with atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities, but with a negotiated settlement that leaves Japan in control of much of Southeast Asia, while Britain maintains dominance in India and Australia. China remains divided between Japanese-occupied territories and various competing Chinese factions. Without the unifying experience of fighting fascism together, the wartime alliances that shaped our post-war world never form. There's no special relationship between Britain and America because there's no unified America. There's no NATO because there's no clear Soviet threat. There's no United Nations because there's no consensus about what the post-war world should look like. Instead, by 1960, you have a fractured global system where regional powers compete within their spheres of influence while trying to avoid triggering nuclear war. It's more stable in some ways. No massive proxy wars, no arms race consuming huge percentages of national budgets. But it's also more stagnant. Innovation slows because there's no single driving competition pushing all boundaries simultaneously. The technological revolution that gives us transistors, computers, and eventually the internet happens very differently. The transistor is invented in Toronto in 1952 by researchers at the Great Lakes Confederation Technical Institute, but without the massive military spending that drove computer development in our timeline, electronic computing advances much more slowly. By 2000, this alternate world has sophisticated mechanical systems, efficient manufacturing, and regional prosperity. But they don't have the internet as we know it. They don't have global satellite communications. They don't have the technological integration that makes our modern world possible. It's a world that's simultaneously more peaceful and less dynamic than ours. Regional powers have learned to coexist, without global conflict, but they've also settled into patterns that discourage the kind of revolutionary thinking that drives rapid technological advancement. And all of this, every bit of it, traces back to 3 cigars in a Maryland field. The absence of a unified United States didn't just change North America, it changed the fundamental dynamics of global politics, economics, and technology for over a century. Next time, we're going to get personal with this alternate timeline. We're going to meet specific families and individuals whose lives were completely transformed by the different path history took. Because behind all these grand political and technological changes are millions of human stories, love stories, success stories, tragedies, that show us what it really means when history takes a different turn. The butterfly effect of those 3 cigars isn't just about nations and wars and inventions. It's about people, and their stories are going to break your heart. I'll see you next time when we explore the human equation of alternate history. Welcome back. Today we're going to do something different. We're going to step away from the grand sweep of nations and wars and focus on something much more intimate and powerful: individual human lives. Because behind every alternate timeline are millions of personal stories, dreams fulfilled and dreams crushed, loves found and loves lost, talents discovered and talents buried. I want you to meet the Washington family. In our timeline, they're part of the Great Migration, AGCET. Sharecroppers from Alabama who pack up everything they own in 1920 and head north to Detroit, looking for factory jobs and a better life for their children. James Washington gets hired at the Ford Rouge plant, his wife Sarah finds work in a laundry, and their son Robert grows up to become a Motown songwriter who helps define the sound of the 1960s. But in our alternate timeline, the Washington family never leaves Alabama. They can't, because they're not free to leave. You see, in this world where the Confederacy won independence, slavery didn't end in 1865. It evolved. The Confederate decision to arm slaves in exchange for freedom created a 2-tier system that lasted much longer than anyone expected. Some slaves earned freedom through military service, but the vast majority remained enslaved until the Confederate Civil War of the 1880s finally forced complete emancipation. James Washington's grandfather was one of those soldiers who fought for Confederate independence in exchange for his freedom. But the promise of freedom came with strings attached. Free blacks in the Confederacy faced legal restrictions that kept them tied to the land almost as tightly as slavery had. They couldn't travel between states without passes. They couldn't own property in certain areas. They couldn't vote or hold public office. So when young James Washington is born in 1895, he grows up in a world that's technically free but practically constrained. His family sharecrop the same land his enslaved great-grandfather worked, under terms that keep them perpetually in debt to white landowners. There's no Great Migration north because there's no unified industrial north to migrate to. The rump United States has some factories, but they're 300 miles away across an international border that requires passports and work permits that sharecropping families can never afford. James grows up, marries Sarah, and has children who grow up to sharecrop the same land. His son Robert, who in our timeline becomes a Motown legend, spends his life picking cotton and dreaming of music he hears on scratchy radio broadcasts from Memphis and New Orleans. He writes songs, beautiful songs that capture the pain and hope of his community. But he never gets the chance to record them, never gets discovered, never makes it to Detroit because Detroit is in a different country. Robert's son, let's call him Marcus, grows up in the 1950s in a Confederacy that's finally beginning to modernize. The old plantation system is breaking down, mechanization is reducing the need for agricultural labor, and there's talk of civil rights reform. But it's too late for Marcus's family. They're trapped by generations of poverty, lack of education, and social restrictions that have kept them from building wealth or social mobility. In our timeline, Marcus would have been part of the civil rights movement. In this alternate world, he participates in the Confederate civil rights movement of the 1960s, which is smaller, less organized, and ultimately less successful because it lacks the federal power that enforced change in our timeline. The Washington family's story illustrates something heartbreaking about alternate history, how political decisions ripple through generations, shaping not just the course of nations, but the dreams and possibilities of individual families. But let's travel north and meet a very different family, whose story shows how the fracturing of America created unexpected opportunities. In Milwaukee, capital of the Great Lakes Confederation, we find the Kowalski family. In our timeline, Stanislaw Kowalski immigrated to Chicago in 1905, worked in the stockyards, and saw his children gradually assimilate into American culture while losing touch with their Polish heritage. But in this alternate world, there's no massive industrial magnet like Chicago drawing immigrants from all over Europe into a melting pot. Instead, the Great Lakes Confederation has developed a very different approach to immigration and cultural identity. Cut off from the vast agricultural regions of the American West and South, the Confederation needs skilled workers and innovative thinkers. They actively recruit immigrants not just as cheap labor, but as partners in building a new kind of society. When Stanislaw arrives in Milwaukee in 1905, he finds a place that wants to preserve and celebrate his Polish skills and traditions while giving him opportunities to advance. The Confederation's rotating capital system means that cultural communities maintain strong regional identities. Milwaukee becomes the center of Polish-American culture in ways that never happened in our timeline. Stanislaw doesn't work in anonymous factories. He joins worker cooperatives that combine Polish craftsmanship traditions with American industrial innovation. His son Joseph grows up bilingual and bicultural in ways that would have been impossible in the assimilationist pressure of our timeline's America. He becomes an engineer who specializes in precision manufacturing, combining Polish metalworking traditions with cutting-edge industrial design. By 1940, he's running a cooperative that produces the most advanced machine tools in North America. Joseph's daughter Anna represents something that never existed in our timeline. A third-generation American who's more connected to her ethnic heritage than her grandparents were. She speaks fluent Polish, spends summers in Poland studying traditional crafts, and brings back ideas that revolutionize manufacturing processes in the Confederation. The Kowalski family's success story shows how the fracturing of America allowed for different models of cultural development. Instead of a melting pot that homogenized ethnic differences, the Great Lakes Confederation developed what they called a cultural mosaic, distinct communities that maintained their identities while contributing to a common civic culture. But the most poignant story might be that of Frederick Douglass himself. In our timeline, Douglass escaped slavery in 1838, became one of America's greatest orators, and lived to see slavery abolished. In the alternate timeline, Douglass's escape attempt fails. He's recaptured and sold to a plantation in Mississippi, where he spends another 30 years in bondage. When the Confederate decision to arm slaves creates opportunities for freedom through military service, Douglass is too old to fight. He watches younger men march off to earn their freedom while he remains enslaved. It's not until the Confederate Civil War of the 1870s that he finally gains his freedom, at age 55, with most of his life behind him. But Douglass doesn't give up. Even at 55, even after decades of enforced illiteracy, he learns to read and write. He becomes a leader in the Confederate civil rights movement, but his speeches now carry the weight of 30 additional years of bondage. His autobiography, Life and Times of a Confederate Slave, published in 1885, becomes one of the most powerful indictments of the Confederate system ever written. Douglass lives until 1902 in this timeline, long enough to see the first generation of truly free black children in the Confederate States. His later speeches focus not on the slavery he experienced, but on the kind of society his grandchildren might build. It's a different kind of legacy, less triumphant, more tragic, but perhaps more profound in its understanding of how injustice shapes not just individuals but entire generations. Now let's travel west to San Francisco, where we meet someone whose story shows how the fracturing of America changed the entire trajectory of American culture. Samuel Clemens, who never becomes Mark Twain. In our timeline, Clemens traveled the Mississippi River, experienced the vastness of American geography and culture, and channeled that experience into stories that captured the American spirit. But in the fractured timeline, there is no unified American culture to capture. The Mississippi flows through multiple nations with different laws, different currencies, different social systems. When young Sam Clemens tries to work as a riverboat pilot, in the 1850s, he finds himself dealing with international shipping regulations, multiple legal systems, and constant border inspections. The river that should connect a continent instead divides it. The colourful characters and folk wisdom that inspired Huckleberry Finn are fragmented across different national cultures that don't communicate with each other. Clemens eventually settles in New Orleans, which has become a major port for the Confederate States, but has lost its connection to the broader American river system. He writes stories, but they're regional stories about Louisiana culture rather than continental stories about American identity. He becomes a successful local author known as the Sage of the Delta, but he never achieves the global recognition of Mark Twain because his work lacks the universal American themes that resonated worldwide. His most famous work in this timeline is Adventures of Jacques and Jean, a story about two Creole boys navigating the complex racial and cultural boundaries of Confederate Louisiana. It's a good book, even a great book, but it speaks to a specific regional experience rather than the broader human themes that made Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn immortal. The absence of Mark Twain represents something profound about what we lost in this alternate timeline: the development of a truly continental American voice that could speak to universal human experiences through specifically American stories. But perhaps the most fascinating cultural development in this fractured world is what happens to jazz music. In our timeline, jazz emerged from the unique cultural mixing pot of New Orleans and spread northward through the unified American transportation and communication networks to become a global phenomenon. In the alternate timeline, jazz still emerges in New Orleans, but its spread is limited by the political fragmentation of the continent. Confederate authorities, worried about the racial implications of music that brings black and white musicians together, restrict jazz performances. The music that does develop is more constrained, more careful about challenging social boundaries. But here's where the story gets interesting. Jazz finds an unexpected home in the Spanish Caribbean. Cuban musicians visiting Confederate ports hear this new music and bring it back to Havana, where it merges with Afro-Cuban rhythms in ways that never happened in our timeline. By 1920, the Caribbean has become the center of jazz innovation, while the form struggles to develop in its birthplace. Meanwhile, the Great Lakes Confederation develops its own musical tradition that combines European folk traditions with industrial rhythms. Polish polkas merge with Irish reels and German waltzes to create something they call factory music, complex polyrhythmic compositions that reflect the mechanical precision of industrial work. The Pacific Republic, connected to Asian cultural traditions through trade and immigration, develops a unique musical form that combines Mexican mariachi, Chinese opera, and Hawaiian slack guitar. It's beautiful and distinctive, but it never achieves the global influence of jazz because the Pacific Republic lacks the cultural export mechanisms that a unified America possessed. Immigration patterns tell their own story of transformed lives. In our timeline, Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty welcomed the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to a single nation that promised opportunity and freedom. In the fractured timeline, immigrants face a bewildering array of choices. The rump United States still offers opportunity, but its smaller size and limited resources mean fewer immigrants can be absorbed. The Great Lakes Confederation actively recruits skilled workers but has strict quotas. The Pacific Republic welcomes Asian immigrants but restricts European immigration. The Confederate States need labor but maintain social restrictions that make them unattractive to most immigrants. The result is that immigrants sort themselves by nationality and skill level in ways that create much more ethnically homogeneous regions. Italian immigrants concentrate in the Great Lakes Confederation, where their craftsmanship skills are valued. Chinese immigrants focus on the Pacific Republic. Eastern European Jews, fleeing pogroms, find the most welcome in the rump United States, which has the strongest tradition of religious freedom. This sorting creates fascinating cultural developments but also tragic separations. Families are divided not just by oceans but by new national boundaries that make reunification almost impossible. The American dream of unlimited opportunity is replaced by multiple, more limited dreams that depend on which fragment of America you can access. But perhaps the most heartbreaking stories are those of the families divided by the new borders themselves. Consider the Johnson family of Virginia. When Virginia joins the Confederacy, the family is split. The father supports Confederate independence, but his oldest son believes in the Union cause and flees north to Pennsylvania. For 50 years, these family members live just 100 miles apart, but might as well be on different continents. Different currencies make travel expensive. Different legal systems make permanent relocation difficult. Political tensions make cross-border visits socially dangerous. The son grows old and dies without ever seeing his father again, and the grandchildren grow up thinking of their relatives across the border as foreigners. These personal tragedies, multiplied across millions of families, show the human cost of political fragmentation. The United States wasn't just a political entity, it was a space where families could stay connected across vast distances, where individuals could reinvent themselves by moving to new regions, where a national culture could emerge from the mixing of diverse local traditions. When that space disappeared, millions of personal possibilities disappeared with it. Dreams were constrained by borders. Talents were limited by regional resources. Love stories were cut short by passport requirements. The butterfly effect of those 3 cigars didn't just change the course of nations. It changed the shape of individual human lives in ways that rippled through generations. Next time, we're going to step back and look at what all of this means for us, living in the timeline we actually inherited. We're going to explore what studying this alternate history reveals about the fragility and strength of the American experiment, and what lessons it offers for understanding our own world. Because the most important question isn't, what if those cigars had never been dropped? It's, what does this alternate timeline tell us about the world we actually live in? The answer might surprise you. It certainly surprised me. I'll see you next time for our final chapter, when we discover what the mirror of alternate history reveals about our true face. Welcome back for our final chapter together. We've traveled through an incredible journey, from 3 cigars in a Maryland field to a completely transformed 20th century. We've seen nations rise and fall, technologies develop along different paths, and individual lives shaped by the butterfly effects of a single moment in 1862. But now I want to ask you the most important question of all. What does this alternate timeline tell us about the world we actually live in? Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Studying what America could have become reveals just how miraculous and fragile the America we inherited really is. And that realization is both humbling and terrifying. Let's start with something that might shock you. Modern Pentagon war games still use the Confederate victory scenario, not because military planners are nostalgic for the Old South, but because they want to understand how unified nations can fragment under stress. The classified reports from these exercises, partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests, contain some sobering conclusions. The same forces that could have torn apart 19th century America, regional economic differences, cultural conflicts, political polarization, nochalisa, they still exist today. The Civil War settled the question of whether states could secede, but it didn't eliminate the underlying tensions that made secession seem attractive in the first place. Pentagon analysts have identified multiple scenarios where modern America could face what they call constitutional crisis points. What if a major economic collapse coincided with irreconcilable political deadlock? What if climate change created massive population movements that overwhelmed some regions while emptying others? What if foreign powers started exploiting internal American divisions the way Britain and France almost exploited the Civil War? The computer models suggest that even 21st century America, with all our technology and institutional safeguards, could fragment under the right combination of stresses. It's a sobering reminder that national unity isn't guaranteed by constitutions or traditions. It requires constant effort and shared commitment to common values. Business schools have reached similar conclusions. Harvard Business School now teaches a course called The Confederate Paradox that uses our alternate timeline to explain organizational failure. The Confederacy's economic problems, ASA, trying to maintain old systems while adapting to new realities, mirror the challenges facing modern corporations disrupted by technological change. Professor Clayton Christensen, who developed the theory of disruptive innovation, argues that studying Confederate economic contradictions helps business leaders recognize their own vulnerable moments. The plantation system was the Confederacy's core competency, but it became their fatal weakness when they needed to industrialize. Similarly, many successful companies fail because their greatest strengths become obstacles to necessary change. This insight has revolutionized business strategy. Companies now plan for their own Confederate moments, times when their greatest assets might become their greatest liabilities. The alternate history of American fragmentation has become a template for understanding change management in the modern world. But perhaps the most profound applications come from an unexpected field: social psychology. Researchers at Stanford and MIT have used our alternate timeline to study something they call contingent nationalism. The idea that national identity depends on shared experiences that could easily have been different. Their studies reveal something fascinating about how Americans think about their country. When people are told the story of the lost Confederate battle plans and asked to imagine the alternate timeline we've explored, their attitudes toward American institutions change dramatically. They become more appreciative of federal power, more supportive of national unity, and more willing to compromise on regional differences. It's as if seeing how easily America could have fragmented makes people value the unity we actually achieved. The psychological term for this is counterfactual gratitude, appreciating what you have by imagining what you could have lost. But the research reveals something even more striking. Americans who learn about the alternate timeline also become more aware of ongoing threats to national cohesion. They're more likely to see political polarization as dangerous, more concerned about regional economic inequality, and more supportive of policies that strengthen national unity. In other words, studying how America could have failed makes people more committed to ensuring it doesn't fail in the future. This has led to some unexpected applications. Conflict resolution specialists now use alternate history exercises to help divided communities find common ground. By imagining how much worse their conflicts could become, groups often discover shared interests they hadn't recognized. Marriage counselors report similar results. Couples who explore what-if scenarios about their relationships, what if they'd never met, what if they'd made different choices, often emerge with stronger appreciation for what they've built together. The technique works because it forces people to recognize that their current situation, whatever its problems, resulted from countless positive choices and fortunate circumstances that could easily have been different. But let me share with you the most mind-bending discovery from this research. Studying alternate history actually changes how people make decisions in the present. Psychologists call this the 3 cigars effect. People who understand how small changes can have massive consequences become more thoughtful about their own choices. They're more likely to consider long-term impacts, more willing to make sacrifices for future benefits, and more aware of how their individual actions affect larger systems. It's as if learning about the butterfly effect makes people more responsible butterflies. This has profound implications for everything from environmental policy to international relations. When people truly understand how fragile complex systems can be, they become more invested in maintaining them. Climate scientists have started using our alternate timeline to illustrate this point. They show how the fractured America of the alternate timeline might have produced 30% lower carbon emissions by developing differently. It sounds like good news until you realize that a fragmented America also would have been unable to lead global climate action. The unified America that gave us the industrial might to win 2 world wars and the technological prowess to reach the moon also gave us the carbon emissions that are changing our planet's climate. But that same unified America might be our best hope for coordinating the global response climate change requires. It's a reminder that every historical path involves trade-offs. There are no perfect timelines, only different sets of benefits and costs. But here's what really gets me about studying this alternate history. It reveals how utterly dependent our modern world is on the specific version of America that emerged from the Civil War. Consider the internet you might be listening to this on right now. In our timeline, it emerged from DARPANET, a Defense Department project designed to create communications networks that could survive nuclear attack. That project only existed because the Cold War created pressure for military innovation. And the Cold War only developed the way it did because a unified America was strong enough to challenge Soviet expansion. In the alternate timeline, with no unified America and no clear Soviet threat, there's no equivalent research pressure. The fractured nations of North America develop regional communication networks, but nothing like the global internet that transforms our world. Similarly, the space program that put humans on the moon emerged from competition between American and Soviet superpowers. In the alternate timeline, with multiple smaller powers and no clear bipolar rivalry, space exploration develops much more slowly. By 2000, they might have achieved what we accomplished by 1970, but they never experienced the dramatic acceleration that competition created. Even GPS, W2, the system that guides your phone and your car, exists because the US military needed precise navigation for intercontinental ballistic missiles. In a world without unified America and Soviet competition, navigation remains a regional concern solved by less elegant methods. The smartphone in your pocket, the satellite TV in your home, the medical technologies that extend human life. So many of these innovations trace back to research programs that only existed because a unified America had both the resources and the competitive pressure to push technological boundaries. This doesn't mean the alternate timeline is worse in every way. Remember, their more fragmented development might have been better for the environment. Their regional specializations might have preserved cultural diversity that our melting pot approach erased. Their smaller-scale conflicts might have caused less human suffering than our global wars, but it does mean that the technological civilization we inhabit, with all its benefits and problems, depended on the specific historical path that started with 3 cigars not being dropped in a Maryland field. And that brings us to the most important lesson of all, recognizing that nothing about our world was inevitable. We look around at American global leadership, at technological progress, at the gradual expansion of human rights, and we think these developments were somehow destined to happen. But they weren't. They resulted from countless individual choices, random chances, and specific circumstances that could easily have been different. The America that emerged from Civil War victory wasn't just a political entity. It was a space where continental-scale thinking became possible. It was a laboratory for democracy that showed the world how diverse populations could govern themselves. It was an economic zone large enough to support the kind of innovation that changes civilization. When that space almost disappeared in 1862, when it was saved by nothing more substantial than a corporal's curiosity about discarded cigars, we came within a whisker of living in a completely different world. Understanding this makes our actual history seem both more precious and more precarious. The freedoms we enjoy, the prosperity we've achieved, the global influence we wield, none of it was guaranteed. All of it required the right choices at the right moments, by people who had no idea how much depended on their decisions. That Union corporal who unwrapped those cigars couldn't have known he was saving American democracy. Abraham Lincoln, signing the Emancipation Proclamation, couldn't have foreseen that he was enabling the Civil Rights Movement. The engineers who built the Transcontinental Railroad couldn't have imagined they were creating the foundation for global economic leadership. But their choices, accumulated across millions of individual moments, created the trajectory that led to our world. And that means we're making equally consequential choices right now, even if we don't recognize them. The decisions we make about technology, about environment, about how we treat each other, these choices are creating the timeline our grandchildren will inherit. The 3 cigars teach us that history is always balanced on a knife's edge. Every moment contains multiple possible futures, and we're constantly choosing which one becomes real. So the next time someone tells you that current trends are inevitable, that problems are too big to solve, that individuals can't make a difference, remember those 3 cigars in a Maryland field. Remember how easily everything we know could have been different. Remember that the world we inherited wasn't destined. 24. It was created by people who faced impossible choices and somehow found ways to choose wisely. And remember that we face our own impossible choices every day. The timeline we create depends on whether we have the wisdom to choose, as well as those who came before us. The butterfly effect isn't just about the past, it's about the future we're creating right now, one choice at a time. Alternative history isn't about nostalgia or regret. It's about recognizing that every moment holds multiple futures, and we're always choosing which one becomes real. Those 3 cigars in a Maryland field remind us that the world didn't have to turn out the way it did, and that means the future doesn't have to turn out the way current trends suggest it will. We're all corporals walking through meadows, making choices that seem small but might change everything. The question is, what envelope will we pick up? What plans will we unwrap? What future will we choose to create? Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the timeline that never was. I hope it's changed how you think about the timeline that is, and I hope it's inspired you to make choices worthy of the miraculous, fragile, contingent world we've inherited. The butterfly is still flapping its wings, the future is still unwritten, and the next chapter of human history is waiting for us to decide what it will say. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep wondering about the roads not taken and choosing wisely which road to take next.